If you could only buy one investment for the long term, ito ang nire-recommend ni Warren Buffett para sa karamihan ng mga investors, ang S&P 500. So what makes the S&P 500 special? Pwede pa bang mag-invest sa S&P 500 ngayon, maski mataas na siya? At paano mag-invest sa S&P 500? As always, this video is for educational purposes only, hindi ito financial advice. So always do your own research before investing. Your investment is your responsibility. Before I continue, quick shoutout muna sa mga bagong YouTube channel members ko. Kay user B9K8, Gay Payumo, DC Trader, Ronaris, Lance Hill Tolentino, Harold, and Vanessa Chan. Thank you so much for joining as channel members and supporting my YouTube channel. I really appreciate your support. So, ano nga ba ang S&P 500? The S&P 500 is an index made up of 500 leading publicly traded companies in the US. These 500 companies represent the largest and most liquid companies in the US, from technology to financials, healthcare, industrials, and many more. Think of it as a basket containing 500 of the largest companies in the US. At sa loob ng basket na ito ay mga malalaking kumpanyang malamang familiar na sa'yo like Microsoft, Nvidia, Amazon, Meta, Google, at marami pang iba. These companies represent a large portion of the US stock market and different sectors. Dahil dito, ang S&P 500 ay kadalasang ginagamit as benchmark or barometer ng performance ng US stock market and economy. Here are the top 10 holdings of the S&P 500 Index. Maski na merong 500 companies sa S&P 500 Index, around 38% of the index is concentrated sa kanyang top 10 holdings. This shows how influential these mega cap companies have become in driving the performance of the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is a market cap weighted index, which means the larger the company, the larger its weight in the index. Kaya mga malalaking kumpanya like Nvidia, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google occupy bigger positions than smaller companies in the S&P 500. The index is regularly reviewed throughout the year. Companies that no longer meet the requirements will be removed, while new companies can also be added. That's why the S&P 500 is constantly evolving. Ito naman ang sector breakdown ng S&P 500. Technology ang kanyang largest sector, making up about 39% of the index. Ang next largest sectors are financial services at around 11%, communication services at 10.64%, consumer cyclical at 9.9%, healthcare at 8.3%, and industrials at 7.82%. You cannot buy the S&P 500 index directly, pero pwede kang mag-invest sa ETFs and funds that track the index and closely mirror its performance. So ngayon, pag-usapan naman natin ang advantages of investing sa S&P 500. Unang-una, it offers broad diversification. Pag nag-invest ka sa S&P 500, you are investing in a basket of 500 of the largest companies in the US. Kaya yung investment mo is spread across different sectors, including technology, healthcare, financials, consumer discretionary, and many others. So you're not relying on the success of a single company. Second is you get exposure to America's largest and leading companies. The S&P 500 allows you to participate in the growth of many of America's leading companies through a single investment. Another reason is simplicity. Successful investing does not have to be complicated. Pag nag-invest ka sa S&P 500 ETF or feeder fund, hindi mo na need mag-research ng individual stocks. Pwede kang mag-dollar cost averaging so you don't have to time the market. So just be consistent and stay disciplined in investing for wealth building. Historically, the S&P 500 has delivered average annual returns of around 10 to 11%. Pero hindi ibig sabihin nito nakikita ka ng 10 to 11% every year. Kasi may mga years na malaki ang itinaas at may mga years din na malaki ang binagsak during major crisis like dot-com bubble noong 2000 to 2002, nag-negative 23% noong 2002. Noong global financial crisis noong 2008, nag-negative 38%. And bumagsak din nung nag-pandemic, pero mabilis lang siya naka-recover. And nag-negative 19% noong 2022 due to high inflation and high interest rates. Over the past 50 years, the S&P 500 delivered positive returns in 39 out of 50 years, or about 78% of the time. And then it delivered negative returns in only 11 years, or around 22% of the time, which happened during major crisis. Like any investment, the S&P 500 also has its own risk that investors should be aware of. Una-una, it only provides exposure to US companies. Diversified ang index but it only includes US companies. So pag bumagsak ang US market, bagsak din ang investment mo sa S&P 500. While the S&P 500 contains around 500 companies, a significant portion of the index is now concentrated sa large technology and tech-related companies. These companies have delivered strong growth, kaya significant ang impact nila sa performance ng S&P 500. Pero kapag bumagsak ang technology sector, it can also lead to larger swings in the S&P 500 index. Kaya kapag takot ka sa red market, baka magpanik ka at mapabenta ka pag biglang bumagsak ang S&P 500. But for me, I buy more pag nag-red ang market. Lagi naman siyang nakaka-recover at mabilis lang maka-recover. Maraming nagsasabi na overvalued na raw ang US market. So ang tanong, is it too late to start investing in the S&P 500? If you look at the chart, parang nakakatakot na mag-invest kasi nasa record highs na ang market. Pero nung nag-start akong mag-invest sa US stock market noong 2018, yan din ang naririnig ko na sinasabi ng iba, mataas na, overvalued na. Totoo naman talaga kasi nung nag-start ako noong 2018, nasa all-time high na rin ang S&P 500. Pero if we look at the long-term chart, makikita natin na nagkakaroon talaga ng corrections at market crashes. Pero palagi itong nakaka-recover at paulit-ulit na nakapag-reach ng bagong all-time highs over the years. As companies expand their businesses, grow their earnings, and continue to innovate, tumataas din ang value nila over time. That's why new all-time highs are often a sign that businesses are growing and creating more value. Pero syempre, hindi naman laging papataas ang market. Magkakaroon pa rin ng corrections, bear market, at market crashes. But what matters is that the S&P 500 has repeatedly recovered and continued to reach new all-time highs over the long term. Walang nakakaalam kung saan papunta ang market, kung kailan magkakaroon ng correction, at kung kailan magkakaroon ng market crash. Instead of trying to predict the next correction or market crash, many investors choose to stay invested and focus on the long term. One strategy that works well for the S&P 500 and pwede rin ito sa mga global feeder funds is dollar cost averaging or peso cost averaging. By investing regularly, you can gradually build your position without having to worry about timing the market. Sabi nga ni Peter Lynch, far more money has been lost by investors preparing for corrections or trying to anticipate corrections than has been lost in corrections themselves. So just stay invested and focus lang on the long term. So maraming nagtatanong, paano daw mag-invest sa S&P 500? I will share 3 ways to invest sa S&P 500. Ang direct way to invest is through foreign brokers where investors can buy S&P 500 ETFs directly. However, investors in the Philippines should be aware of the regulatory and access considerations. Kasi alam naman natin na gusto ipagbawal ng SEC ang mga foreign brokers kasi hindi raw sila registered sa SEC. Sa ngayon, naka-block na ang interactive brokers sa mga major telcos gaya ng PLDT, Globe, and pati na rin daw sa Converge, naka-block na rin siya. Pero Filipinos living outside the Philippines can still access interactive brokers. Kasi sa Pilipinas lang naman naka-ISP block. Kaya pag nasa Pinas ka, invest at your own risk. Personally, I use interactive brokers and GoTrade. Here are 4 of the most popular ETFs kung saan pwede kang mag-invest. All of them track the same S&P 500 index. So similar lang ang performance nila. Magkaiba lang sa ETF provider, expense ratio, and fund characteristics such as liquidity and share price. SPY is the oldest and most liquid S&P 500 ETF. Kaya ito ang madalas na ginagamit ng traders at institutional investors. Pero ito rin ang may pinakamataas na expense ratio at 0.095%. Ang VOO at IVV naman ay mas mababa, ang expense ratio at 0.03%. At parehong malaki rin ang assets under management. SPYM ang pinakamababa ang share price. Nasa $86 per share siya ngayon. Kaya mas madaling bumili ng 1 share. Pinakamababa rin ang expense ratio niya at 0.02%. Pwede namang bumili ng fractional shares lang. You don't have to buy the whole share. I invest in VOO and SPYM. Pag gusto kong bumili ng whole share, sa SPYM ako. Pero pag fractional share, sa VOO naman. Take note, pag dollar ang investment mo at pag dumaas ang dollar, tataas din ang value ng investment mo kasi papataas ang dollar. Nung nag-start ako mag-invest, nasa around 50 pesos per dollar pa lang. Ngayon, nasa 61 pesos na per dollar. Pag wala kang account sa foreign broker, another option is through local brokers gaya ng Dragonfly, First Metrosec, and Call Financial. Meron silang feeder fund that invest in S&P 500, ang BPI US Equity Index Feeder Fund. Kaya lang mas mataas ang annual fees, nasa 1.5%. Other option is through local banks gaya ng BPI, BDO, RCBC, East West Bank, and Metro Bank. Yung nasa BPI ay same feeder fund na ino-offer sa Dragonfly, First Metrosec, and Call Financial. Sa East West Bank daw ang mababa ang annual fees at 0.5%. Pero $500 ang minimum investment at kailangan ng US dollar account sa East West Bank. Remember, investing in the S&P 500 is not a get-rich-quick scheme. So this is a long-term wealth builder. Hindi siya pwede sa mga mainipin at gusto agad kumita ng malaki pag nag-invest. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.